Every morning at 6:45 a.m., James Williams adjusted his neatly pressed tie in the same spot at the Central Avenue bus stop. 20 years of military service had ingrained in him a sense of precision that never wavered. The other regular commuters had grown accustomed to his presence. The tall, distinguished man who always carried a leather-bound book and a travel mug of fresh coffee. The ritual started at 5:30 a.m. in his modest but immaculate apartment. James would wake without an alarm, a habit formed during his years as a Marine Corps officer. His morning routine was a symphony of efficiency. 15 minutes for physical training, 20 for grooming, and another 25 for preparing and enjoying his breakfast while reading the morning news on his tablet. His closet told its own story. Suits arranged by color, shoes polished to a mirror shine, and ties organized with military precision. Today, he selected his favorite charcoal gray suit, a deep blue tie, and the Oxford shoes he bought to celebrate his first civilian job after retirement from the Corps. Each item was part of the armor he wore in his new life as a security consultant for high-profile corporate clients. The walk to the bus stop took exactly 7 minutes. James enjoyed these morning moments, taking in the city as it stirred to life. He passed Mrs. Chen opening her flower shop, exchanging their daily silent nods. The aroma of fresh bread from Giovanni's bakery filled the air, and the early morning stock boys at the corner market were always starting their day as he walked by. At the bus stop, James had his spot, not claimed through territory or ego, but simply through the natural order that develops when someone becomes part of the daily landscape. He stood 3 feet from the signpost, his leather-bound book. Today it was Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, held in his left hand, while his right maintained a steady grip on his travel mug. The regular commuters had their own stories about him. Sarah, the young paralegal, had once seen him help an elderly woman with her heavy shopping bags, walking her 3 blocks out of his way without hesitation. Mike, the construction foreman, still remembered the day James had quietly broken up a heated argument between 2 teenagers before it turned physical, his mere presence and calm words diffusing the situation. But what none of them knew was that behind James's quiet demeanor lay a history of leadership that had earned him not just the Silver Star for valor, but the unwavering loyalty of every Marine who'd served under his command. They didn't know about the nights in remote outposts where his calm decision-making had saved lives, or the times his compassionate leadership had helped young Marines find their path. Now, as the morning sun began to paint the city buildings in shades of gold, James opened his book to the passage he'd been contemplating. Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. V1. He read silently, the words resonating with his personal philosophy. The bus would arrive in exactly 9 minutes, and until then, this quiet moment was his time for reflection, a peaceful pause before another day of guiding his security teams with the same steady hand that had once guided his Marines. To the casual observer, he was simply another commuter. But to those who knew how to look deeper, every movement, every carefully pressed crease in his suit, every measured gesture told the story of a man who had spent his life in service to others and continued to do so, just in a different uniform. The autumn air carried a sharp chill that Tuesday morning, different from the usual gentle October breeze. James noticed the change as he stood in his customary spot. The pages of Marcus Aurelius's Wisdom opened before him. The regular morning crowd had thinned due to the coming holiday weekend, leaving the bus stop quieter than usual. At 6:52 a.m., the normal peace was interrupted by the sound of expensive shoes on concrete and loud laughter echoing off the buildings. 3 young men, looking like they'd stepped out of a high-end fashion magazine, made their way down the street. Their designer clothes, pristine despite the late hour, spoke of money and privilege. The leader wore a custom-made Italian jacket that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. James observed them through his peripheral vision, a skill honed through years of situational awareness training. The young men had clearly spent their night at the prestigious Luna Lounge, the new exclusive club that had opened 3 blocks away. Their mannerisms and slightly unsteady gait suggested they were still riding the wave of an expensive night out. The tallest of the 3, sporting a designer watch that caught the early morning light, noticed James first. He nudged his friends, his expression shifting from party-induced joy to something more challenging. James could read the situation like a book. He'd seen that look before, usually on the faces of young recruits who hadn't yet learned that true strength had nothing to do with dominance. "Well, look what we have here," the one with the Italian jacket said, his voice carrying the artificial confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences. "Didn't know this bus stop had a dress code." His friends chuckled, the sound hollow in the morning air. Sarah, the paralegal who usually stood near James, clutched her bag tighter and moved a few steps away. Mike, the construction foreman, watched the scene unfold from behind his coffee cup, his face showing concern. The other regular commuters began to shift uncomfortably, creating a small circle of empty space around the developing situation. James remained still, his eyes moving steadily across the pages of his book. In his mind, he wasn't at a bus stop in the city. He was back in training, teaching young Marines the power of restraint. Patience is not passive, he used to tell them. It is active, focused, and powerful. The 3 young men, their designer shoes scuffing the clean sidewalk, moved closer to James. They formed a loose semicircle around him, their body language a clear challenge. The one with the watch spoke next, his words carrying an edge that cut through the morning quiet. "Hey, we're talking to you," he said, his voice rising. "Don't you know it's rude to ignore people?" His friends shifted their stances, unconsciously moving into what they thought were intimidating positions. What they didn't notice was how James's feet had already adjusted their position, how his spine had straightened ever so slightly, or how his grip on his book had changed from casual to ready. These were subtle changes, invisible to the untrained eye, but to anyone with combat experience, they would have been glaring warning signs. The morning sun now cast long shadows across the bus stop, and in those shadows, a story was about to unfold. One that would teach these young men a lesson they hadn't expected to learn on their way home from a night of partying. James calmly sipped his coffee, the warmth of the dark roast bringing back memories of early mornings on base, teaching young Marines the art of self-control. His mind drifted to a particular training session where he taught his unit that true power lay not in the ability to strike, but in the wisdom to know when not to. The young man in the Italian jacket, who'd introduced himself rather loudly as Alexander, continued his performance for his friends. Every few seconds, he would step slightly closer to James, like a child testing boundaries. The morning light caught the gold ring on his finger, a college championship ring that he kept turning, perhaps unconsciously seeking confidence from past glories. Sarah, the paralegal, had pulled out her phone and was pretending to text, but James could see her finger hovering over the emergency dial button. Mike, the construction foreman, had moved closer to the group, his work-worn hands gripping his coffee cup a little too tightly. The other commuters had formed a loose circle, like an audience at an uncomfortable street performance. "You must think you're something special," Alexander said, his designer shoes scraping against the concrete as he shifted his weight. "Standing here every day in your fancy suit, acting like you own the place." His friends, Thomas and Marcus, they'd made a point of using each other's names loudly, moved to flank him, creating what they thought was an intimidating triangle. James turned another page in his book, his movements deliberate and unhurried. To the casual observer, he appeared to be simply reading, but his mind was mapping every sound, every movement, every subtle shift in the energy around him. He'd done this countless times in far more dangerous situations, where the stakes were life and death rather than wounded pride. The morning traffic had begun to pick up, the sound of cars creating a steady background rhythm. A street vendor was setting up his coffee cart nearby, the smell of fresh beans adding another layer to the scene. These normal morning activities continued, oblivious to the tension building at the bus stop. Alexander made a show of looking at his expensive watch, then at his friends. "Maybe we should teach him some manners," he said, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. Something about James's stillness was beginning to register, like a distant warning bell. James used this moment to make his first deliberate movement. He reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a simple bookmark, a faded photograph of his old Marine unit. As he carefully placed it between the pages, the young men caught a glimpse of the image, though they didn't yet understand its significance. The air had grown heavier with tension, like the moments before a storm. 2 more regular commuters had arrived, immediately sensing the situation and moving to the edges of the scene. Mrs. Chen, opening her flower shop across the street, paused in her morning routine to watch, her experienced eyes reading the situation with concern. James could feel the young men's frustration growing at his continued silence. He'd seen this pattern before, how uncertainty could lead to rash actions, how pride could push people past the points of reason. But he'd also learned that these moments were opportunities, chances to turn conflict into understanding. The question was whether these young men were ready for that lesson. The moment shifted when Alexander, growing increasingly frustrated with James's composed demeanor, decided to escalate the situation. He made a show of stumbling forward, his expensive leather shoes scuffing the sidewalk in a way that was too deliberate to be accidental. His shoulder accidentally bumped into James's arm, testing the boundaries of physical contact. James's coffee cup wavered slightly, but not a single drop spilled. The same hands that had once steadied a rifle during sandstorms could easily maintain control of a simple travel mug. The other commuters held their breath, sensing a shift in the morning's energy. Sarah had stopped pretending to text and was now openly watching, her legal training perhaps already cataloging potential witnesses. "Oh man, I'm so sorry about that," Alexander said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "These designer shoes can be so slippery." Thomas and Marcus snickered behind him, though their laughter carried an edge of nervousness. Something in the way James had absorbed the contact, too controlled, too practiced, had finally registered in their minds. James looked up from his book for the first time, his eyes meeting Alexander's with the same steady gaze that had once calmed panicked soldiers in the heat of battle. His movement was deliberate, almost graceful, as he slowly closed Meditations and tucked it into his suit pocket. The morning sun caught the silver threading in his tie, and for a moment it resembled the glint of military medals. "Young man," James said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded hundreds, "I believe you're operating under some misconceptions." He turned fully to face the group, his stance shifting almost imperceptibly into what his former Marines would have recognized as his teaching position. The change in James's engagement level sent a visible ripple through the group. Alexander, despite his bravado, took an unconscious step back. His friends, reading the sudden tension in their leader's shoulders, began to look less sure of their position in this impromptu performance. Mrs. Chen had stopped arranging her morning flowers entirely, her hands frozen mid-motion as she watched the scene unfold. Mike, the construction foreman, had moved closer, recognition finally dawning on his face as he noticed the way James carried himself, the same way Mike's brother, a former Army Ranger, did. A city bus rumbled past, not their bus but another route, its whoosh of air creating a momentary break in the tension. In that brief pause, James noticed how young these 3 really were. Behind their designer clothes and practiced arrogance, he could see the same uncertainty he'd often observed in new recruits, young men trying to prove themselves without really knowing how. "Perhaps," James continued, his tone remaining measured and clear. "We could have a different kind of conversation." He adjusted his tie, the movement drawing attention to his hands. Hands that were too steady, too sure in their movements to belong to someone easily intimidated. The morning had grown brighter now, the sun fully above the city's buildings, casting sharp shadows that seemed to draw lines between the players in this sidewalk drama. In the distance, their bus's familiar engine could be heard approaching, though none of the participants in this scene were thinking about their morning commute anymore. The morning air grew still as James stood at his full height, his 6'2" frame now commanding the space in a way that made the bus stop feel like a military briefing room. Alexander, who had been reaching for James's book pocket, froze mid-motion, his hand suspended in the space between them. 22 years ago, James began, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made everyone, including the passing coffee vendor, stop to listen. I had a young Marine under my command. Bright kid, lot of potential, but he had something to prove to the world. He adjusted his tie, the movement so precise, it could have been used to calibrate military equipment. Thomas and Marcus had already begun to edge away from their friend, their previously unified front crumbling under the weight of James's presence. The morning sun now highlighted the perfect crease in his suit pants, the characteristic fold that only years of military press could achieve. That young Marine fought strength was about intimidation. James continued, each word measured and clear. One morning, much like this one, he made a choice that could have ruined his life. The construction foreman, Mike, had now moved close enough to notice the small, telltale pin on James's label, the kind only awarded for distinguished service. Alexander's face had lost its artificial confidence, the expensive Italian jacket no longer seeming like the armor he'd thought it was. His hand, still suspended in the air, began to tremble slightly. The regular commuters watched in fascination as the scene transformed from a potential confrontation into something more like a life lesson. "Would you like to know what happened to that Marine?" James asked, though it wasn't really a question. His right hand moved to his chest pocket, where the edge of the faded photograph was visible. He became one of the finest leaders I ever had the honor to serve with, because that morning, he learned that true strength isn't about what you can do to others. It's about what you choose not to do. The bus stop had become eerily quiet, the city sounds seeming to fade into the background. Even the street vendor had stopped his morning setup, coffee pot suspended mid-pour, entranced by the scene unfolding before him. "So now, young man," James said, his eyes meeting Alexander's with the kind of steady gaze that had once guided Marines through desert storms. "You have the same choice he had. What kind of story do you want to tell about this morning?" A car horn honked in the distance, breaking the spell just enough for Alexander to finally lower his hand. His designer watch caught the sunlight, no longer a symbol of status, but now looking more like the young man's chained to something he needed to let go. In that moment, the regular commuters witnessed a transformation. The three young men who had arrived full of false bravado were now standing in the presence of something they'd only seen in movies, real strength, the kind that comes not from intimidation, but from years of leading others, from making hard choices in impossible situations, from understanding that true power often lies in restraint. Their bus was now visible in the distance, its familiar rumble growing closer, but no one at the stop was checking their watch or gathering their belongings. All eyes remained fixed on this moment of truth between a former Marine and three young men who were about to learn one of life's most valuable lessons. The recognition hit Alexander like a wave as his eyes finally focused on the details he'd been too arrogant to notice earlier. The way James's shoes were polished to a mirror shine, the precise angle of his tie, the ramrod straight posture that spoke of decades of service. But it was the Marine Corps ring that finally broke through his fog of pride. A simple band of silver and gold that carried more weight than all the designer labels he was wearing. "Sir," Alexander said, the word coming out before he could stop it, his voice now stripped of its earlier pretense. His friends had already taken several steps back, their eyes fixed on the silver star pin they'd just noticed on James's label. Thomas, the tallest of the three, had gone pale as he recognized the significance of that small piece of metal. His own father had one, kept in a glass case above the fireplace with a photo of men in desert fatigues. Mrs. Chen, still watching from her flower shop, had set down her morning delivery and was now standing at full attention. Her brother had served, she would later tell the other shop owners, and she recognized the bearing of a senior officer when she saw one. The construction foreman, Mike, had removed his hard hat in a gesture of unconscious respect. 20 years, James said, his voice now carrying the weight of every mission, every responsibility, every life he'd been entrusted with. 3 tours, hundreds of young men and women under my command. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph he'd been using as a bookmark. The image showed a group of Marines standing proud in their dress blues, James at the center, his face a decade younger, but bearing the same steady expression. The morning sun had fully risen now, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. In those shadows, Alexander saw his own reflection in a store window. A young man in expensive clothes who'd nearly made the biggest mistake of his life. His college ring, which he'd been so proud of moments ago, now felt small and insignificant compared to the history etched in James's simple Marine Corps band. I'm sorry, sir," Alexander stammered, the "sir" coming naturally now, no longer a mock term, but one of genuine respect. "My grandfather was a Marine. He would be ashamed of me right now." His voice cracked on the last words, real emotion breaking through the last remnants of his practiced facade. A gentle breeze rustled through the street, carrying the scent of Mrs. Chen's fresh flowers and the morning coffee from the vendor's cart. The regular commuters watched as something remarkable happened. The space between James and the young men transformed from a battlefield of egos into a bridge of understanding. James looked at the photograph one more time before carefully returning it to his pocket. "Your grandfather's service is part of a legacy," he said, his tone now that of a mentor rather than an adversary. "Every morning when I put on this suit, I remember the uniform it replaced and the responsibilities that come with either one." The bus was now just a block away, its familiar squeal of brakes marking the approaching end of this moment. But for Alexander and his friends, time had stopped. They stood there, 3 young men in designer clothes, finally seeing the true measure of the man they'd foolishly tried to intimidate. A leader, a teacher, and a living example of the kind of strength they'd been clumsily trying to project. The city bus pulled up to the stop, with its familiar hydraulic hiss, but none of the regular commuters made a move to board it. The driver, sensing the weight of the moment unfolding on his route, simply nodded to James through the window and waited. He'd seen the whole scene in his rearview mirror while stopped at the previous light. James reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a business card. Simple, clean, with just his name and contact information. The security consulting firm's logo was embossed in silver, much like the pin on his label. "Your grandfather's service," he said, holding the card out to Alexander, "means you're part of a larger family than you might realize." Alexander's hands were steady now as he took the card, the earlier trembling gone. His designer watch caught the morning light, but its gleam no longer seemed to matter. Thomas and Marcus had moved back to their friend's side, not as reinforcements this time, but as supporters in what had become a moment of personal growth. "Sir," Thomas spoke up, his voice carrying the same respect he used when speaking to his father, the Silver Star recipient. Would you tell us about your service?" The question hung in the morning air, a bridge being built between generations. James checked his watch, a simple, reliable timepiece that had seen him through 3 tours. "Perhaps another time," he said, his voice warm but firm. "Right now, what you 3 need is rest, water, and time to think. He pulled out his phone and began typing. "I'm calling a car service I trust," he explained, his fingers moving with military efficiency. "They'll get you home safely." Sometimes, the bravest thing we can do is accept help when we need it. The other commuters watched as the former Marine handled the situation with the same care he'd once used to guide young recruits. Mrs. Chen had emerged from her shop, carrying 3 bottles of water she'd retrieved from her storeroom. She handed them to the young men with a gentle smile, her own small contribution to the morning's lesson. The construction foreman, Mike, had already called ahead to his crew, letting them know he'd be taking a later bus. As they waited for the car, Alexander looked down at the business card in his hand, then at his own college ring. "My grandfather," he said quietly. He never talked much about his service, but he had a way of standing, just like you do. I never understood until now. The Blacktown car pulled up smoothly to the curb, its driver professional and discreet. James opened the door for the 3 young men, the gesture both a courtesy and a final lesson in dignity. "Remember this morning," he said as they climbed in. "Not as a mistake, but as a moment when you chose to be better." As the car pulled away, the regular bus stop scene began to resume its normal rhythm. People started boarding the patient bus, but something had changed. The air felt lighter, as if a storm had passed and left everything cleaner in its wake. Sarah, the paralegal, found herself wiping away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. James straightened his tie one final time and retrieved his book from his pocket. The morning sun now cast his shadow long against the sidewalk, the shadow of a man who had just turned what could have been a moment of conflict into one of transformation. 1 week later, the morning light at the bus stop held a different quality. James stood in his usual spot, the pages of a new book, Sun Tzu's The Art of War, open in his hands. The regular commuters had settled back into their routine, though they now greeted him with a deeper respect, having witnessed the power of quiet strength. Mrs. Chen's flower shop had a new morning customer. Alexander, dressed in a simple but well-tailored business suit, was carefully selecting a bouquet. Through the window, James could see him speaking with Mrs. Chen, his demeanor respectful and engaged. The designer labels were gone, replaced by something more authentic. As Alexander approached the bus stop, the difference in his bearing was striking. His shoulders were straight, his steps purposeful, and his eyes clear with the look of someone who had found a better version of himself. The flowers, he explained to James, were for his grandfather's memorial. He'd finally asked to hear the stories of his Marine service, and his family had gathered to share them. "Sir," Alexander said, standing at a natural parade rest that would have made his grandfather proud, "I want you to know something. After that morning, I went home and found my grandfather's Marine Corps photo album. I stayed up all day looking through it, reading his notes, understanding for the first time what it means to be part of something bigger than yourself." James closed his book, giving Alexander his full attention. The morning commuters, while pretending to be absorbed in their phones and newspapers, were listening intently. Even the coffee vendor had slowed his preparations to catch the conversation. "My friends," Alexander continued, "Thomas and Marcus. They've changed too. Thomas has been spending more time with his father, finally asking about his Silver Star. Marcus has started volunteering at the Veterans Center downtown." He paused, then added with a slight smile, "We've all started taking morning classes instead of spending nights at clubs." The construction foreman, Mike, arrived at the stop, nodding to both men with understanding. He'd seen many such transformations in his years working with veterans on his crew. Mrs. Chen, watching from her shop, smiled as she arranged her morning display, adding an extra flag to her window in honor of the moment. "Your grandfather would be proud," James said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "Not just of who you're becoming, but of your courage to change." He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a small, well-worn book, a Marine Corps leadership manual he carried through his service years. "This helped guide me," he said, offering the book to Alexander. "Perhaps it can do the same for you." The young man took the book with reverence, understanding the value of such a gift went far beyond its pages. As their bus approached, Alexander stood tall beside James, no longer an antagonist, but a student of life's most important lessons. The morning sun caught both men's profiles, one who had long ago learned the true meaning of strength, and one who was just beginning to understand it. The regular commuters watched as both men boarded the bus together, a simple moment that represented something profound. How one morning's choice to show wisdom instead of force had created ripples of change that would continue long after the story of the Marine at the bus stop was over.